Thanks, Warren. Yeah, apologies for the length of the title of this talk. I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners, and for myself in Brisbane. I'm in South Brisbane. That's the Turrbal and Yagara people. Um, so I'm going to be talking about today. The work I'm going to be talking about is actually in a paper that we had published last year, I think, in Spatial Statistics. And it was a special issue of Spatial Statistics that was looking at deep learning in statistical modeling. And just like to acknowledge my collaborators on that paper, Joel Dabrowski from CSIRO Data 61 and Dan McKinlay from CSIRO Data 61, and also my colleague in CSIRO Environment, Srikant Janardhan, who's a groundwater modeler. I'm also going to acknowledge that the work that was published in that paper I mentioned was almost a pilot study, if you like. So we did some modeling and we got some nice results, and it ended up sort of getting us some funding to continue with that research and to sort of scale up that project. So there've actually been many more people over the last year working in that this research area with us. And so I'd like to just acknowledge those collaborators as well. This is all part of a research portfolio in CSIRO, actually within the environment business unit of CSIRO. And this was an initiative called Digital Water and Landscapes, which was really looking at how digital technologies, new technologies and new modeling approaches, such as neural networks, deep learning, I suppose part of that, and how they could be used for improving our situational awareness of water resources and the environment. And yeah, if you wanted to check out some of the other things that were part of that portfolio, there's a link there. There were some really interesting other projects in modeling 3D distribution of above ground biomass, flight analytics, water quality and quantity, all sorts of interesting things. So encourage you to check that out if you're interested. Today's talk is really about these hybrid models. So looking at how we might use deep learning in statistical models. And to some extent, deep neural networks and statistical models as, sort of modeling paradigms seem like a bit of an odd couple. Both have their pros and cons, but sometimes seem at odds with each other. Deep neural networks have some pretty amazing abilities. They're really powerful predictors. They're also really good at ingesting very large data sets, which I'll talk about later on in the talk. Neural networks can also be trained on a wide variety of data types, and we'll talk about that in this talk as well. They're highly expressive, and sometimes you'll hear them referred to as universal function approximators. So they can, kind of express a very, very wide class of functions, which makes them, sort of generically useful for a wide variety of tasks. And they also can make use of high performance computing systems, GPUs in particular. One of the benefits of them, which I'll again talk about in this talk, is they can remove the need to engineer predictive features from data sets. In a lot of applications, we can spend time trying to think up what are the predictors that I should be including in my model. And to some extent, neural networks can kind of do this in an automatic way. But they have their cons as well, right? So they're often massively over parameterized, which is, kind of goes against this, the parsimony, which we're often striving for in statistical modeling. They're easy to overfit to training data, which is, problematic, can be problematic. Difficult to interpret, unlike a statistical model. And they're really deterministic functions. And, we're often interested in things like uncertainty quantification as statisticians. We also don't necessarily know how robust their predictions are. They're black boxes. We're not 100% sure what's going to come out of them for all inputs that we put in, how they're going to behave. And on the other side of this modeling paradigm, we've got statistical models, which are usually looking to strike some sort of balance between predictive power and interpretability. They're probabilistic models, so they quantify uncertainty naturally, and typically they have meaningful parameters. Regression models, for example, have meaningful parameters and allow us to incorporate prior knowledge from previous studies. For example, if you're a Bayesian. Cons can be that for some models they're difficult to fit to massive data sets, and having less parameters in a model, whilst it can make things more interpretable, can also result in less predictive power. So despite their differences, we're going to think of this talk as a bit of a journey of mine through this space of looking at how we might use deep learning as a statistician. And the application area is groundwater modeling. And so if you haven't worked in this space before, groundwater beneath the ground, difficult to observe except at locations that have wells, and is in a state of flux, typically as a result of inputs and outputs. So it's constantly changing as a result of rainfall, evaporation from trees, say, that are drawing water out of the ground, users who are like farmers and industry who might be pumping water out for agriculture or industrial use, and possible changes in things like rainfall, for example, to do as droughts, climate change, things like that have an impact as well. So as I mentioned, we typically only have measurements of how groundwater changes through time at points in space where wells are installed. And these could either be locations where somebody is manually taking measurements of depth to groundwater, so how deep is the groundwater from some datum, the surface, or they have a piezometer installed, which is measuring the pressure of the water column and therefore working out what the height of the water is from which the depth can be calculated. And one of my co-authors on this paper had just been working on a development project, I think, in Bangladesh, which is has a lot of agriculture, heavily reliant on groundwater for irrigation, and they've been looking at sustainability of groundwater use and so forth. So this part of Bangladesh is in the Indo-Gangetic Basin, and Srikanth and I had worked together a lot in the past, and this was probably the densest data set that I'd seen in terms of groundwater before. So you can see here we have the area in Bangladesh, and these grey points are all of the locations where we had groundwater wells. And so there were 437 wells here, and they were really, really well measured. So excuse the pun there. But they had weekly observations from 1985 to 2016. So we had over 500,000 observations. So we were really curious about trying to model groundwater with some deep learning approaches, and I was keen to impose some statistics in there as well. And so we thought this looked like a sort of dream data set to do that with and to try it out. But we had a number of questions, I suppose. And the first of these was, could we predict groundwater dynamics at unobserved locations in this alluvial aquifer in Bangladesh using remotely sensed or very coarse spatio-temporal predictors? And these are things like rainfall and evaporation and things like that there are a lot of remotely sensed products we had available. Another question was, if we can do that, can we also reliably quantify predictive uncertainty using these sorts of models? And also wondering whether we could reclaim some degree of interpretability from a neural network type model if we structured it in such a way that it had sort of an additive structure. And so what I mean there is maybe think along the lines of like a GAN or something like that, where you might have, if you're running an R R model with a GAM, you can kind of say, I want this to be a sum of some, smooth non-parametric terms or something like that. I want you to tease it apart to a couple of different additive components. We also had another question was, can we handle missing data in a neural network? Typically, neural networks, you can't have an NA or a missing value in your data set. So we had some questions too about how we could handle missing data and whether we could encode it using a unique scale of value. So for example, could my model cope if I put, say, -1s into the neural network wherever there was something missing and everything else had a positive number for covariance? Okay, so this is essentially what we had for our modeling purposes. So I mentioned before we had this area in Bangladesh, and that these grey areas, these grey dots, represent points where there was a well with some data. And at every one of these wells, we had spatial data sets. And what we wanted to try and do was to sort of learn the water balance that was changing the groundwater from these really coarse, remotely sensed data products. And so we only had a few. We had the ones that we thought were probably most important. We had precipitation grids, evapotranspiration grids, or potential evapotranspiration grids, and then we had the local digital elevation model. So you think of this as like the topography of the land. And what we did was we created these little patches around each of our wells. So think of these as little snapshots around the well that is describing what the local precipitation or the local landscape looks like. And so that's sort of capturing local hydrology, if you like, that we were hoping we could use to make some predictions about the groundwater dynamics. So if I write this out as sort of what the data set looked like, we had a data set consisting of groundwater depth observations at a particular point in space S at a particular time. The point in space, we would say have an easting and northing for that. The T here is, think of this as the time, but as a predictor, we might use, say, the year that the observation is taken in. And then we have some tensors here. And just when I say the word tensor, just think of a multi-dimensional array. So, it might be, for example, for the DEM, this is just a 2D grid for the local elevation. But for things like PET and rainfall, think of this as like a data cube. So where every slice in the data cube is a month of, say, the rainfall grid for a month stacked on top of each other. So we might have a year of local precipitation. We'd have 12 of these layers as the third dimension. And we created a model that looked like this. This was sort of a model of our own design to test out some ideas here. And we nicknamed this model the Hydra because it sort of had these multiple heads. If you're familiar with sort of mythology, there's this mythical creature called the Hydra, which had multiple heads and guarded the gates to the underworld. So each of these heads here is going to ingest different data types, and there's some more heads here. But ultimately, they're all going to lead to a single prediction of groundwater depth at a particular time, in a particular point, and a particular point in time. So this Hydra architecture, it actually had two sub-architectures, which we've got here as sub-architecture 1 and sub-architecture 2. And those architectures are sort of serve different purposes. Sub-architecture 1 models dynamics as a function of those local water balance predictors. So in the previous slide I showed you, we kind of had these little patches around each well that had the local rainfall and the local evaporation and the local landscape. So sub-architecture 1 is really just ingesting those and doing something with it, which we'll get to. And sub-architecture 2 is modeling broad-scale spatio-temporal trends. So the only thing that goes into sub-architecture 2 is the year, so the point in time and the point in space. And this architecture, if you um, yeah, this architecture has a feature which a machine learner would call delayed information fusion. So what do we mean by that? Well, we mean these two parts of the neural network are kind of operating independently until they kind of get joined together at the bottom and something happens with their outputs. So they're almost like separate functions that kind of come together at the end. And we're going to use a log likelihood loss function for training this neural network. So we're thinking about the data in a statistical way, and we're training the model in a statistical way. And what we're actually doing is each of these sub-architectures is going to, for a given input, it's going to give the mean and variance of a Gaussian distribution. So each of these architectures parameterizes a Gaussian distribution, which sum together and give a log normal predictive distribution for the groundwater depth. Okay, so as I said, we kind of talked about this this model as the Hydra. The Hydra model processes each of those spatial or spatio-temporal inputs through a series of convolutional layers. And these are a common type of layer that's used in neural networks that are used for sort of image classification and things like that. These sorts of layers are usually described as feature engineering layers or as deriving salient representations from the inputs that are most useful for prediction. And I'll talk about those in some more detail further down. But each of those kind of processes an input independently of each other, and then they kind of get into the deeper layers of the network. These are sort of images that are coming through and being turned into new images, if you like, that are useful for prediction. And then these kind of get flattened and turned into a vector at some point. So they kind of lose their spatial and temporal structure at some point. They get concatenated together and processed through a pretty standard type of neural network called a densely connected or feed-forward neural network. And this is the neural network that at its output parameterizes a mean and a variance. Sub-architecture 2 is again just a feed-forward neural network, so a pretty standard type of neural network. And again, is parameterizing a mean and a standard deviation of a Gaussian distribution that I'll get to as we go on. So in machine learning papers, it's really common to see models described in this kind of a way, in this sort of plumbing diagram or flow chart. And I often find it quite dissatisfying, I guess, as a way to describe a model, because it often doesn't give enough mathematical detail about what exactly is going on in this, in these blocks, these Lego blocks that have all been plugged together. So one of the things we really strove for in this spatial statistics paper was to kind of pull all of these bits apart and present them in a way that statisticians might, get some more out of it and see how it connected to the sorts of modeling that we do. So what's in these conv2D blocks, for example, these 2D convolutional blocks? Well, if we look at these, write these out mathematically, we see that they're actually not particularly complicated. And the maths in here is very closely linked to the sorts of models that statisticians are, very familiar with, because it's effectively there's just a lot of linear algebra going on under the hood. But essentially, each of these 2D convolutional blocks applies a series of filters, and I've indexed the filters here by this lowercase f. And these filters are learned during training. Each filter is parameterized by a tensor of weights, which are called W here, and also a scalar called B. often call the intercept term in these models a bias. It's not the bias that we think of in a statistical sense with an estimator. But essentially, the network is going to learn a set of filters that get applied to a tensor, and each filter generates a new two-dimensional grid derived from its input tensor grid. And each tensor that comes into the neural network, so the tensors, the input tensors here are called Q, and the output here is called O. And each input tensor Q has channels. So we have the rows and columns that we saw spatially before, but we also have channels. And in an image like a digital elevation model, where we have at every point in space, we only have the elevation, that would have one channel. If you had a color image, that would have three channels, a red, green, and a blue channel, for example. Okay, so when you're using these convolutional blocks in a neural network, there is a step that's often not really talked about, which is that the input tensor is padded with a bunch of zeros. And this is essentially just to ensure that the images coming out at the other end of the block have the same size. And that might become clearer as I show some more of these slides. But effectively, it's this padded version of the tensor or image that we're calling Q here. It's not actually the original one, it's this padded version of it. And that's sort of the input to this block in the neural network. And as I said before, we have three subscripts on this input tensor, and they're corresponding to the row, the column, and the channel. And as I said, we might have one channel for a DEM or a digital elevation model. We had pictures of cats and dogs in color. We might have three channels for red, green, and blue. And for our groundwater problem, for our spatio-temporal predictors, remember I showed you earlier, we had, say, rainfall, and we took, say, like the previous 12 monthly snapshots of rainfall. Then we might have 12 channels here, one for each month. And essentially, the W here is this convolutional kernel. So it's in this case, a 3x3 kernel, which simply just a matrix of weights. And these are applied, these weights are multiplied by the pixel values in this image Q, this buffered or padded image Q. And so sorry, this is just this linear kernel. Told you about that. We have this intercept term, which is just an offset or an intercept. They call it a bias. And as we apply this 3x3 kernel, so we would choose the size of the kernel. This is like a beforehand modeling choice, how big this kernel would be. It might be 3x3, it might be 5x5, but in this case, it's a 3x3. And what we're doing is we're multiplying each of the weights in the kernel by the pixel value, summing them up, and adding the bias term. And as we do that, we start to populate a new image that's coming out here, which is our O. And we keep going pixel by pixel until we've populated this new image from the one that came in. And so W here is the matrix of weights is really trying to learn a set of weights that can turn the input into something that's going to be useful for the downstream prediction, which is here predicting groundwater depth. So as I said before, we here had, I go back, we had a W1. As I mentioned before, we're actually learning multiple filters here. So multiple of these kernels that we move around the image. So we would then do the same thing for W2 and so forth. But if we look at these Lego blocks in our in our neural network diagram, you can see usually it's described as, in this case, 3 by 3 by 1 by 8. So in this case, I've chosen to have 8 filters, or 8 of these different convolutional windows that I'm going to move around the image to learn the relationship between the input and the output. We also have, as we saw before, this is essentially just, a linear operation that's applied to the image. But neural networks are universal function approximators because they have this nonlinearity inside them in the blocks. And so some activation function is applied to this output after it's done its convolution. And a typical activation function that gets used is a rectified linear unit, like a very common one to use these days for various reasons. And essentially, the ReLU activation function is just to take any negative values that are in that output and set them equal to 0. So it's very simple, straightforward, nonlinear operation there. So as I said before, we have 8 of these filters that are being learnt. So if we had a little local image of a digital elevation model coming into a convolutional 2D block, what would we expect to come out the other end? We're actually getting a set of 8 images coming out the other end that are the application of each of these filters to the image. The other type of block that is very common to see in these models are these dense blocks, or densely connected blocks. And if you've used neural networks, standard feed-forward neural networks in the past, you would have used these. Essentially, these are just essentially a linear model or a regression model if we look at this. So you have some sort of vector coming in, an input vector that has a weight matrix, it's multiplied with a weight matrix, and it has a bias vector, or a vector of intercepts, if you like, added to it. And then it also goes through some sort of activation function, often a rectified linear unit as well, where we just set negative values to 0. In this case, if I go back to this diagram, you can see that by the time we get to this point in our sub-architecture 1, we've actually generated a lot of different images through these convolutional blocks, and then can sort of flatten them to a vector and concatenated them. And if we look at what's going on here, we're actually turning the input into that layer is actually a vector that's almost 2,000 elements long. This densely connected block is actually doing a dimension reduction step. It's actually projecting this vector down to a 32-dimensional vector. And from that point onwards, it's working in a lower dimension space. And this can help to keep the number of parameters in a neural network small. And I use the term small in inverted commas, given that this neural network has about 75,000 parameters in it, but for a neural fairly small. Okay, now so far, I guess in the talk, it's probably seemed like a bit of a machine learning or a neural network heavy talk, but I guess this is the point where, as statisticians, we can start to think about how we impose some of our thinking into a model and how we would train a model. So the loss function is a really easy way to do that with these sorts of models. So often, in a regression task in machine learning or deep learning, there might not be a lot of thought given to this. It might just be that somebody trains it and minimizes mean squared error. But we can really use whatever we want as the loss function, and using a negative log likelihood loss function as a statistician seems like a sensible thing to do. So in this project, we decided that we would try to use a log normal distribution as a predictive distribution or a data model for the groundwater depth data. And essentially what we've got here is I'm saying that for any groundwater depth observation yi, given the spatio-temporal inputs, so that's my rainfall and PET and so forth, and my other inputs, which are my date and my point in space, my coordinates. And if I knew the parameters of my model, I had all of that, then the predictive distribution for that groundwater depth would be a log normal distribution. And now the log normal distribution has like the normal distribution has a mu and a sigma squared that parameterizes a Gaussian on the log scale. In this case, we're actually saying that sigma and that mu are functions of the inputs and also the parameters. But for simplicity, I've just put the x's in here. So we're essentially saying I've got a log normal distribution for my groundwater data, but the parameters of that log normal distribution are going to be coming out of this neural network. And so this is essentially, how we think about doing that. So as I said before, we've got these two sub-architectures. Sub-architecture 1 is dealing with the spatial and spatio-temporal information, and sub-architecture 2 is only taking the coordinate and the point in time. So this architecture is kind of dealing with the local hydrology, and this sub-architecture is dealing with the broad spatio-temporal trends. And so sub-architecture 2 is spitting out a mu and a log sigma squared. Sub-architecture 1 is doing mu1 and log sigma 1 as outputs. So the two sub-architectures of the neural network are spitting out Gaussian distribution parameters. And then what we're saying is that the parameters of the log normal distribution are sort of additive. We can get by adding those two things together, or adding the variances and adding the means. So this is sort of this additive structure component to the neural network. Once we've defined a loss function like that, the training of the model is I guess a little bit different as well. We typically train these types of models using stochastic gradient descent, or in this case, mini batch stochastic gradient descent, and some sort of training algorithm, in this case, an algorithm called RMS-prop. But essentially using some sort of gradient descent where you're computing the gradient vector of the log likelihood and trying to follow that to minimize the negative log likelihood or maximize the likelihood. But this is done, the log likelihood is done or estimated over small batches of the data. And often a batch size might be 32 randomly selected data points in the training data set. So you're essentially, if you want to think about it this way, you're essentially using these random samples of the data to get a Monte Carlo estimate of the gradient of the log likelihood. And using this sort of training algorithm requires us to set a step size, which is how large a step are we taking with each sort of iteration of the approach in the direction of steepest descent here with the negative sign. And these algorithms will also usually have some sort of, in this case, parameters alpha here, which are taking into account that you want to take slightly larger steps when the gradients are very flat, and smaller steps when the gradients are very steep. So probably this is a little bit of a difference to when we do maximum likelihood in a statistical setting where you typically include all of your data in the optimization. As I mentioned earlier, it's really easy to overfit a neural network, which is hardly surprising when you have that many parameters in a model. And there's a lot of options you have at your disposal for trying to prevent this from happening. There's ones that we're familiar with as statisticians, like applying regularization and penalties, different L1 and L2 penalties or combinations of those to the parameters in a neural network. There's other approaches such as dropout, which is an interesting approach where during training, random subsets of the parameters in the network are set to 0 so that it never can quite rely on any particular parameter or node in the neural network being present. And that can stop it from sort of putting too much weight on any particular part of the neural network. People have also tried injecting noise into the data to prevent overfitting. But an approach which I've had a lot of success with in the past, and I think it's just very intuitive to understand, is something called early stopping, which is basically we split our data into different sets. We train on part of the data, and we have non-training data that we kind of look at to check whether or not it's now starting to overfit. And this is kind of easily visualized in this way. So if you think of our data set, we split it into 3 sets. We have the training set, we have a validation set, and then we also have a test set. And on the x-axis here, I've got epochs. You can just think of that as the number of steps we've taken in our training process. And we have our loss function, and we're looking for the point where the loss function is minimized. But often on our training data, the loss function will just continue to go down as we overfit our model. And we can often see that on a validation set, which isn't being used for training. But as we train, we look at the loss for that. And we might see over time that that's starting to rise as the loss on our training set continues to decline. And the idea with early stopping is that you kind of let it keep training for a while and you will let the validation go up. But after a certain amount of time, you lose patience. There's actually a parameter called patience. You lose patience and you stop training and you return back to the lowest validation lost. And you do that by keeping track of the weights from past iterations. So that once you've lost patience, you can go back and restore the weights that gave you the best sort of training and validation loss that were kind of consistent with each other. You can then test your model on some completely unused test data to see how well it performs. So the validation data is never used in training, but you are kind of using it to decide when to stop training. And so we would then typically have a third set of data that we use to actually compute our metrics for how well our model worked. In the groundwater work that we did here, we broke our data up by wells. So we included the records from entire points in space in our training, validation, and test sets. So we had 60% of the wells, or 262 of the wells, used for training, and then 87% of the wells we used to decide when we stopped training in this validation set. And then we had another 87 wells that we used to compute our metrics to see how well we did. And now to show you some results. Okay, so I've got here, this is some outputs from the model, and it's showing the predictions at a well that was in that test set. So it wasn't used in training, and it wasn't used in deciding when to stop training. It's a completely unseen location. And you can see here in this top pane, we've got the black dots that are showing the groundwater records at this site. You can see there's sort of natural cycles, seasonal dynamics in the groundwater to do with precipitation and pumping for farming. And the purple that's plotted over the top of this is showing our predictive distribution from our neural network model. So I don't know how clearly it's coming up on the screen for you, but there's a dark purple line, and that's showing the median here of our log normal distribution. So remember I said excuse me, the neural network is actually parameterizing a predictive distribution, and that the actual outputs that are coming out of the neural network are these mu's and sigma squareds that are the parameters of the predictive distribution or the log normal distribution. And so these dark purple line is the median of that log normal distribution, and these wide intervals here are the 95. Well, the light purple is a 95% predictive interval, and the darker ribbons that you might see here are a 50% predictive interval. So that's the actual prediction of the groundwater depth. What we can also pull out of the model, because it has this additive structure to it, it's actually modeling those mu's and sigma squareds as two additive components. One that's coming from that, and those are Gaussian on the log scale. One is for the seasonal dynamics, and that comes from those images of rainfall and evapotranspiration and so forth. And that's subarchitecture 1, and that's what this has learnt for the time. And so you can see that subarchitecture 1 has essentially learnt the seasonal dynamics in the hydrology from those spatio-temporal predictors. And subarchitecture 2, which only gets given the year and the point in space, is learning these broad temporal, at a point in space, it's learning these broad temporal trends in the groundwater. And those two things add together on the log scale to give us this. And I suppose a thing that I mentioned earlier was in the questions was one thing we were kind of interested in is, well, can we quantify uncertainty with a neural network? And we can do it with these predictive distributions, but how well does it work? And what we found in this particular example was that overall of the data, the coverage was really quite good. The predictions were good as well. Like if we looked at the median absolute deviation, so that purple line, the median line, the deviation between that and the black dots over all of our held out wells, that the deviation was about 0.67 meters, so it was reasonably good. But the coverage was remarkably good at different interval widths that we looked at, and so that was quite exciting for us and compelling that a neural network could do such a good job there. The other really neat thing that we could do with this model was, even though it was only trained on data from wells, we could actually make predictions now at sites where there weren't wells, because the inputs to the model were effectively these patches of rainfall, these images of rainfall, evapotranspiration, and the elevation that we could create at any point in space. And so we could create these maps as well now of what we thought the groundwater levels might look like in space and how they were changing over time. And also we were getting some sort of an uncertainty quantification as well out of this, because every pixel in this map is parameterized by a log normal distribution. And so what we could start to see were things that we already knew from the data, but it was good that it was picking it up. Were things like here you can see there's a kind of a bright blue patch which is showing shallow groundwater in 1995, and that as time was going on, that had disappeared, and that some of these other patches were sort of getting deeper as well. Effectively, what we're seeing is the same thing that we're seeing in this plot here, which is that the broad temporal trend at wells was that groundwater was getting deeper, which means it's sort of being used unsustainably. It's difficult to see that from the top plot, where there's a lot of extra seasonal variability, making it difficult to tease that apart or to see it. So that was good, a good result. And we could also plot those broad spatio-temporal trends as well as maps and maps through time. So here we're looking at on the log scale. It shouldn't be in meters there, so just ignore that. But basically, this is looking at this red broad spatio-temporal trend as a map. And we could kind of look at that as well, just to see how things were changing. And again, seeing that spatial pattern of these shallower areas, which are the blue, are kind of, you can see over time they're just sort of gradually. It almost looks like the contours are moving north as things get deeper. So that was interesting. And we're able to do that. Again, it comes back to the fact that we set this neural network up as having these two sub-architectures that kind of add together at the end. So yeah, we have some ability to regain a little bit of interpretability back by thinking about how we actually structure the neural network as a model. I mentioned as well at the beginning of the talk that we're also interested in missing data, because we usually need complete data sets when we're using these neural network models. And there was an interesting aspect to this data which I've not told you about so far, and that is that the PET grids that we had were actually from the MODIS instrument, and that's on a satellite called Terra. And Terra actually only went into space in about 2000. So actually, from 1985, when the data set started, to 2000, we don't actually have this. And so the model that I've been showing you the results for, all of the grids pre-2000 just consisted of the value -1 in all of the for the PET. And so what we decided to do was to actually remove rainfall from this model. So that was our original architecture. Remember, I talked about the hydra, and what we actually did was we kind of recreated the model, but we removed rainfall from it now. And so what we know is that, well, we've now got only the elevation model and the evapotranspiration model. And the evapotranspiration model is going to have -1s encoded in it before the year 2000, whereas all of the other PET values in there will be scaled. We have to scale everything in these neural network models because of the gradient descent algorithm. So they're all going to be between 0 and 1, and missing values are going to be -1. So there's kind of two well partitioned or distinct sets of inputs that are going into the model. And so we were wondering what would happen if we retrained this network now that we've removed rainfall. And this type of study, where you remove bits of the neural network and see what it does, I think machine learners call these ablation studies. So we decided to do an ablation study on it. And this is what we got, which was really interesting. So this was the original purple plot that I showed you before. And this is what we got when we removed the rainfall from the model. So now you can see that prior to the Terra satellite going up, where we had these -1s encoding the precipitation, it's fitted a model which is sort of just like a mean model, like an intercept model of sorts, with no seasonal variability. And then once the information about the precipitation, the evapotranspiration becomes available, it's actually able to capture the seasonality quite well. We can see though that the scale of the y-axis here is greater. So we do reduce the width of these prediction intervals when we have rainfall in the model, but actually the PET actually can capture quite a lot here of the seasonality in the predictions. But yeah, it was interesting that we could actually include kind of a missing encode missingness, if you like, and that the model would do something sensible. So overall impressions from this study in sort of hybridizing neural networks and statistical models. The pros were that we can train these models very quickly. It took about 5 minutes to train a model. There was a lot of data wrangling. I'm not going to downplay the data wrangling took a lot longer than the training, but about 5 minutes to train the model with about 500,000 observations. This approach of early stopping I have found to be a very effective method in general for preventing overfitting. We only need to store small batches of data in memory at any point in time. So I mentioned earlier that that's one of the benefits of deep learning models and neural network models is because they're trained using these batches in this mini batch stochastic gradient descent. You never actually have to hold all of the data in memory at any one time. You just have to be able to read in batches. And so you can actually store a lot of stuff on disk and stream it off disk as you go. We found that this sort of modeling approach had good coverage properties. The caveat here is that good coverage properties on aggregate, that's sort of looking at everything as a whole. It doesn't guarantee that for any one well you're going to have a really nice prediction, but overall it was quite good. These sorts of approaches of parameterizing probability density functions for predictions in neural networks is sort of an old idea. The original idea was proposed in the 90s for using mixture densities. So there's a thing called a mixture density network, which parameterizes a mixture of normals. So you can use that sort of opens things up to a very flexible class of parametric distributions for modeling your data. Another plus here is that a neural network as an object, a software object, is dictated by the number of parameters in that model. So the size of my neural network as an object is defined by that architecture that I mentioned earlier. And this is actually quite nice. It means you can kind of, you know how big that predictor is going to get. And that's actually in contrast to my experience with things like random forests, where actually the size of the random forest object on disk can actually get really big. If you have a really big data set, it needs to partition things up more and more and more, and you can end up with something that's horribly large at the other end of it. So that was an interesting observation as well, that how big the predictor is going to be sort of a priori. It was also really cool that we could create a regression model that takes images as input and kind of decides along the way what's the important features that are going to lead to a good prediction here, rather than having to kind of try to make up or think about maybe what are the things, summary statistics or something that I should be including in this model to predict the thing I'm interested in. And also, I just mentioned this idea that architecture choice and this idea of delayed information fusion. So having this additive structure, like two neural networks that add together at the end, is a really interesting way to try and reclaim, some sort of interpretability from the neural network as well. You saw that what it allowed us to do was see, a signal that came from a trend and a signal that came from the seasonality, which is kind of neat, I thought. The cons are that typically we have to break our data up into these chunks. We have a training set and a a test set and a validation set. And ultimately, we're only really using, in this case, we only used about 60% of our wells for training. So, we could benefit from maybe k-fold cross-validation and other things like that to sort of, be making better use of all of the data. There's also the fact that it often feels very unsatisfying. It's like, how did I pick these parameters? How did I choose how many filters to put in the convolution and so forth? That often feels like a dark art, and I guess in some respects it often doesn't matter too much. You can try lots of different things and you tend to kind of get similar results. So you don't really, this idea that this is a bit of a dark art and there's a lot of intuition involved is quite true. You just sort of, the more you play with these sorts of models, the more of a gut feeling you get about what's going to work and what's not. I think that's a con. I don't like that aspect of it. It's not very satisfying. Another downside here is that we're basically doing maximum likelihood, and then saying, okay, now that I've got those parameters, here's my predictive distribution. And at no point in that process are we acknowledging uncertainty in those parameters as well. So that's a downside of the approach as well. But in conclusion, I think there's components of these deep learning models that I think are really useful. I think, ingesting large and possibly atypical data sets like audio or, images or video or things like that are things that these allow us to start looking at. It allows us to learn complex high-dimensional functions easily. We can use it with, as I said, complex probability density functions. And automating this idea of the feature engineering and dimension reduction, I think, is particularly powerful as well. So just to conclude, these desirable attributes of statistical models, they can be incorporated into neural networks through the architecture and through the loss functions. But there are drawbacks, and probably the most notable are the limitations on interpretability and the fact that these models are often very data hungry too. You're not going to be fitting a neural network to 100 data points. We were in a situation here where we had 500,000 data points. So they're fit for a particular purpose, I guess. And just in conclusion too, I mentioned at the beginning that what I presented today was really a bit of a pilot project that we did, and that the environment business unit gave us some extra funds to kind of investigate this further, and that we've been working on some other groundwater basins as well. So yeah, if this is of interest to you, feel free to reach out and keep you posted on further developments. And I'll just give a plug again to the Digital Water and Landscapes webpage if that's of interest to anyone as well, where that'll be updated with further information as time goes on as well. So that's it from me, and yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Dan. I think that's the most I've certainly seen of the detail of what goes on in neural nets. I have now a small bit of understanding of what they're doing as compared to previously regarded as a black box, and I'm sure others feel the same. And with a good practical example, that was excellent. I will start with people who are in the room here in Canberra. Has anyone got any questions or comments for Dan? Do you want to come here and speak loud so he can hear?
Hi, greetings of the day. I'm just a Master of Science student, so I'm not as knowledgeable as you. It's just like when I heard of that early stopping currently, so I just listened to that. It depends on validation set. So I was wondering if validation set got some outlier, so does it gonna trigger early stopping?
Yeah, that's a good question. The assumption is always that you have yeah, sort of a homogeneous population of data, I guess, and that, the what's in the training set and the what do we got? I always get confused about the names of these. The training set, validation set, and the test set, are sort of from the same population. And so I think we did, trying to think what we did. We did do some things to try to, make sure that they were all sort of spatially representative and things like that. And also sometimes that they're, you're you might have data sets that are longer than others and that they're all sort of, I suppose stratified in some way across those sets. But yes, definitely. I think, if you had a lot of, I think for individual data points, maybe not so much. Like, if you had a couple of outliers, it's probably not going to trigger anything too badly. But yes, definitely that is something you'd want to be thinking about, is that the results, I guess the term that the ML people would use is like the results are going to generalize as much as they can to, the validation set. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yes, Robert.
Okay, thank you. I guess you can't see me, you just hear me.
I can see. Hello.
That's even more secretive. Robert Niven, W Canberra. So yeah, look, thanks for your study. There's so many things I could talk about. I just want to talk briefly about 3 things. So first of all, I have just led a study on using Bayesian inference on a groundwater basin much closer to you, the Burdekin Basin in Queensland.
Oh, yep.
Prediction of
That's
nitrate.
a big one that's like the size of Britain or something.
Exactly. So, a very nice study. My student has just completed it. It's submitted with the journal. I'm very happy to discuss this with you and what we did in order to apply Bayes in that system. But it's essentially a Bayesian regularization, you could call it.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm very jealous of your data science. We had 130 points.
Right. Yes.
500,000.
This is one of the things that stood out about this data set, was like, I don't think in Australia I'd ever seen something like this. So
yeah. So it was, but we managed to do, it was in a GIS framework with layers. And so we were able to get sort of predictions in layers, so it's all very nice. So I'm happy to take that up with you further rather than.
That'd be great. Yeah.
The second point is that there's a bunch of people working now on joining neural networks with Bayesian inference. And so how to design the neural network to fit with what you're trying to do with your Bayesian inference. That's sort of happening now. In fact, I think I'm chairing or I'm part of a special issue on this. So I'm happy to talk to you about that as well.
That would be great.
The third one is Bangladesh is famous for arsenic. Is this an arsenic basin? Is this the reason why it's so intensively studied?
It's a great question. I had read something about that arsenic thing, and I'm not. I think is it a natural? It's a natural thing, isn't it?
Natural.
It's in the groundwater in the rock. Yeah. No, I don't think that was the reason they got involved. I think this part of the world is one of those that it's so dependent on groundwater, and I think it's become pretty clear, over the past decades that it is declining over a very wide area. And so, yeah, I think that's part of the reason that Srikanth had become involved in that project. I think they were basically trying to quantify the decline there. I don't know whether that's to do with unsustainable use or whether that's to do with climate change, or a combination of the two. But yeah. But yes, no, it wasn't the arsenic. I don't think.
Because that would be a next very interesting step, is to predict the arsenic.
Yes. Yep.
Well, thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks.